This is a short video or keynote lecture on the four great Enlightenment figures Palmer discusses in his chapter on the Enlightenment. Uh, and they include Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Adam Smith. So I have one slide for each, hitting the highlights with a little explanation behind them. First, Voltaire, one of the greatest minds, I think, of the Enlightenment in France. Voltaire's real name was Francois Marie Arouet. He wrote under the pen name or pseudonym of Voltaire, which means French. It's kind of a playful joke on the idea of empty space or empty air. It's kind of a little joke name, I guess you could say. He championed religious toleration. Voltaire, earlier in his career, defended a Protestant who was accused of murder and was executed. So Voltaire took upon himself the cause of religious toleration, anything to advance religious toleration. Voltaire himself was a deist. However, he championed religious toleration, and one of his famous quotes was, "Crush the infamous thing." And what he's referring to as the infamous thing was religious intolerance. And so Voltaire felt that whenever we encountered religious intolerance, we had to crush it out of existence. He also advocated free speech. One of my favorite quotes of Voltaire is, "I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend with my life your right to say it." Just a brilliant saying. Voltaire was not necessarily in favor of abolishing monarchy, however. Voltaire was very good friends, very, very good friends with Catherine the Great of Russia. In fact, Catherine often invited Voltaire to Russia, to St. Petersburg, to kind of exchange his ideas and dialogue and correspond with her. One of his famous works includes the fictional story of Candide, which is a very humorous look at life and existence and meaning, finding meaning in life. So Voltaire. Our next one is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And one of his famous quotes is, "Men are free but remain in chains." That should be plural there. Should be chains, chains. Men are free, but they remain in chains. So how can that be? Well, according to Rousseau, the general will was something to which all individuals freely assented. So we were all freely agreeing to be bound by the general will. So it's a bit of an irony in that. Rousseau preferred a balance between the Enlightenment approach with reason and rational thoughts, and a balance between that and feelings or passions. So I guess you could say that Rousseau was kind of I would put it this way. We talk about Father Moreau and Holy Cross as educating the mind, but not at the expense of the heart. And I think Father Moreau was adopting a notion of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In fact, many look to Jean-Jacques Rousseau as a precursor of the Romantic movement. Rousseau advanced the notion of a social contract between the government and people. So, drawing upon that notion of Jean Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau also takes up the idea of the social contract. Although, again, he felt that it was between the general will. People were ruled by the general will, and they formed this agreement to be ruled by the general will. One of his most famous works includes the novel Amile, Emile. Amile. It's not Emily. The title is not pronounced Emily. It's Amile. And it's, again, a work that looks at the gender roles in society and philosophical ideas, but in the form of a fictional account. We have Baron Montesquieu, again, representing that French Enlightenment. And Montesquieu was primarily noted his promoting of the notion of separation of power in government, so that government power would not be situated in the hands of one person or even a few, but it would be that power was best exercised when it was spread out among many. So power is shared among several bodies in government, and this provided what Montesquieu felt was a system of checks and balances, so that different branches of government, and of course in our government, in our United States government, we have adopted Montesquieu's notions. For instance, we have in our government three branches. We have an executive branch, that is President Obama, or the presidency, We have a legislative branch, which is Congress, and we have a judicial branch, the Supreme Court and the lower courts. So in our government, we've adopted Montesquieu's notions, laid out in his famous work, The Spirit of the Laws. And then finally, we have Adam Smith, who is an example of what we call the English Enlightenment, which, again, the Enlightenment was a European-wide phenomenon. And so it is okay to speak of the English Enlightenment, the German Enlightenment, and so forth. Adam Smith's an example of the English Enlightenment. He applied Enlightenment principles to economics, in other words, the workings of the market and such, and the economies of nations. He rejected the old system that was a carryover from the 1600s, which we called mercantilism. If you remember, the mercantilist notions were those that favored a favorable balance of trade and the wealth of a nation through bullion, gold. And Adam Smith rejected that. He favored a more free market, what he called a laissez-faire, hands off. Laissez-faire is French for like the let it be. Let's let it be. Don't bother with it. Let it be. Laissez-faire. And so Smith advocated a free market. And in his Wealth of Nations, his most famous work is called The Wealth of Nations. And he used as his example a pin-making factory. He said, look, if you have one guy making a pin from start to finish, then he's not going to make many pins in a day because there were a lot of steps involved. So what does Adam Smith do? He looks at the problem of pin making as an example, and he says, look, if you break that job down into its necessary steps, and then you have one guy doing each step, then you can make so many pins because the work is being spread out. And so some consider Adam Smith as kind of a visionary of what would eventually become like the assembly line, so to speak. So there's a quick slideshow on those four Enlightenment thinkers.